Good, please.
Right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to appear this evening. The brief we have submitted outlines our research findings and recommendations in greater detail. Our research focuses on creating an enabling environment for the social sector in Canada. The existing legislative regulatory framework is preventing the sector from reaching its full potential, and our recommendations focus on how the federal government can modernize and innovate in its approach. For decades, sector leaders have argued that the relationship needs to be modernized. The core issue, in our view, is not the government-sector relationship itself. It is how the government supports or detracts from the sector's ability to fulfill its mandate and achieve the best outcomes possible. Focusing on the relationship keeps the conversation about how change should be achieved, as opposed to why the change is needed and why it matters to Canadians. Traditionally, the sector's value has been conceived in terms of its contribution to a healthy democracy and to community life, providing relief to people in vulnerable positions, and volunteerism. In today's reality, this conception is proving to be too narrow. We encourage the federal government to conceive of the social sector in a different way, as a partner and ally in addressing some of Canada's most complex and intractable social, economic, and environmental challenges. You've heard many sector leaders talk about the need for an enabling environment. We define an enabling environment as one where the government safeguards the public interest, supports the sustainability of nonprofits and charities, and optimizes the policy landscape for innovation and experimentation. But what does an enabling environment look like in practice? An enabling environment focuses on a principles-based rather than risk-fearing approach to regulating charities. It values and encourages the sector's contribution to public policy. It integrates and streamlines funding models to reduce red tape for organizations and bureaucrats, shares data on community outcomes to better direct resources towards the programs and services that are making a difference, and focuses on strategic partnership with the sector rather than on a funder-recipient relationship. Our research brief identifies several key roles for how the federal government can relate to the sector. These include regulating the tax-exempt status of registered charities, adjudicating disputes about charitable registration, and facilitating, enabling the social sector broadly by convening key stakeholders, identifying policy gaps, collaborating with other levels of government, for example, in promotion of data sharing, creating space for innovation, and disseminating best practices. Historically, we have focused on the regulating role, how the Canada Revenue Agency Charities Directorate, as the tax regulator, makes decisions about charitable status and monitors compliance. We encourage the committee to focus on the facilitating and enabling role that has for too long been ignored. It is important to situate these roles as very separate functions. In other countries, the tax regulator is not expected to address broader sector issues like funding reform or social finance. These issues are dealt with by a separate government entity that is more appropriately situated to act as an advocate, partner, and convener. Much attention has been paid to the UK model as one that Canada should emulate. The UK uses an arm's-length charity commission, which reports to Parliament but sits independently, to regulate the charitable sector, with an Office for Civil Society embedded within the government as the enabling body. The separation of these functions has proven to be very successful, but the UK model is difficult to replicate entirely because of Canada's federalist context. In addition, our research indicates that the location of the regulator, within or external to government, has less of a direct impact on outcomes. Siloing sector issues in one department or ministry is often less effective at changing the culture of government to think differently about the sector's role and contribution for achieving outcomes for Canadians. It is also vulnerable to changes in government. This is why we are not recommending a dedicated minister for the voluntary or social or third sector. The issues are incredibly complex, and there is very little consensus in the sector on what model or mechanism would be most appropriate. Our recommendations are meant to focus and integrate how the federal government currently works with the social sector to achieve meaningful change. Our research has indicated that separating the regulating and enabling functions would help to address some of the most significant issues currently facing the sector. My colleague Joanne will now discuss our recommendations to move forward.
Firstly, we recommend retaining the Canada Revenue Agency Charities Directorate's role in regulating charities under the Income Tax Act. This regulatory function is narrow, but important, and would benefit from further sector input. We recommend reinstating and re-empowering the Sector Advisory Committee that reported to the Minister of National Revenue on regulatory issues. This committee would have an important role in leading change through the forthcoming amendments to the Income Tax Act. Secondly, we recommend that the Government of Canada also explore the use of regulatory sandboxes to test further changes to the regulatory framework. In a regulatory sandbox, the regulator applies a different set of rules to a small number of organizations for a limited period. The regulator observes its sample and learns by lived experience how the regulated use the new rules. A regulatory sandbox would let the government test proposals like the destination of funds test, for example, without difficult-to-reverse and sector-wide changes. Thirdly, we propose that the Tax Court of Canada be designated as the first point of appeal for Canada Revenue Agency decisions rather than the Federal Court of Appeal, as Dr. Chan discussed. Many sector leaders agree that this approach would improve access to justice for nonprofit and charitable organizations and increase the number of appeals, which would provide more legal cases for the Canada Revenue Agency to use as guidance on compliance issues. Fourth, we propose the creation of a permanent enabling body within the Privy Council office that aligns with a recommendation for an Office for Social Innovation that was put forward by the Social Innovation and Social Finance Strategy. This office would assist with policy coordination and meaningful engagement with the sector and advance an outcomes-driven approach across all of government, rather than aligning with the policy priorities of a specific department. The National Social Innovation and Social Finance Strategy also recommended a Social Innovation Council to advise the office on its direction and strategic priorities. We think this council would be the ideal table for the sector to advise the federal government in its role as an enabler, and propose this as our fifth recommendation. We recommend that the office and council's role be defined in legislation to make them less vulnerable to changes in political priorities. Our final recommendation focuses on investing in sector infrastructure. The sector's many umbrella organizations have an important role in self-regulating, in addition to the regulatory function we discussed, facilitating collaboration and leading change. We propose that the federal government reinstate funding for sector capacity building, research, technology, training, and collaboration. We encourage you to consider this study as an opportunity to help the sector fulfill its enormous potential, rather than focusing only on the deficits, shortcomings, and legislative and regulatory gaps. Thank you for your time and attention. Lisa and I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you both. We'll start